Welcome to Final Fantasy Weekly. I'm Drew Kreisman.
And I'm Ira Kreisman.
And on this episode, we finally get around to wrapping up our conversation on Final Fantasy Tactics. We've concluded the plot, so on this episode we are just going to dive into our last thoughts on some of the big themes, some of the big questions, a couple of little conversations that we wanted to have about the morality and ethics of Final Fantasy Tactics, doing our best as neither experts in art or video games to evaluate this video game as a piece of art, and give our very final thoughts on Final Fantasy Tactics before we move to Final Fantasy VIII. So let us dive into the big themes first that we talked about at the beginning, and some of these we obviously dived into because they're very front and center throughout the story. So we talked about war is hell and class war is hell, and we see a lot of that throughout the story. So I'll ask you, Ira, what did you think were some of the most poignant moments that show us both that war is hell, but also highlighting that it's not just what's going on the battlefield, but the way all of that impacts what's happening at home?
Right. I'm going to go back to the Hawkeye quote from MASH that I mentioned in our intro episode, in that, war is war and hell is hell, and of the two, war is far worse because in war there are innocent bystanders, and that's what is really driven home here, right? Tetra didn't deserve that. She had nothing to do with any of this. And then we get into, the Corpse Brigade. They were promised they would be taken care of if they fought in the 50 Years' War, and now they're coming home to nothing, less than nothing. People are dying as a result of this war, not because they're fighting in the war, but because there's not enough food. There's too much rain, so the crops are flooding. And the nobles aren't doing anything about it. They're not doing anything to mitigate the problem, right? They see the tsunami coming, and they do nothing to try to make it easier on the people who are going to be hurt the most. So as usual, those who have the least are hurt the most. So even though a lot of the dramatic parts of this story are inside the castle walls, right? The backstabbing and the torturing and the demon summoning, we also get to see the people outside the castle walls, the Maludas and the Ygrafs and the Corpse Brigade and the commoners, who just get trampled on over and over and over again. And what it leads to then is a man seizing power, beating them at their own game, taking power, being the most ruthless, and becoming hailed as a hero for it.
And so I'm moved to ask another question, furthering both of these themes, which is, if war is hell, and class war is hell, and as you say, the innocent bystanders are, of course, the ones who are going to feel the largest brunt of it. You could even argue Ophelia, especially if she truly is a Manchurian sure. Ophelia. She's just a girl who was made a pawn in this whole thing. But in order to try to separate those two things, or try to bring an end to, as we've talked about in Game of Thrones, they call it the wheel, right? Did Daddy Barbaneth set this up?
Interesting. Right.
So we talked about in the episode very early on, it was like very first episode where we get the scene where he dies. He says on his deathbed to Ramza, "You will need someone you can trust. You could do far worse," he says, "than Delita." Now we're at the end of the story. We know all the things that Delita has done, all the people he killed who were just in his way, including the very last one being poor Ophelia. But, and now we're going to get into this whole idea of far worse and measuring like who really are the worst people of Ivalice here. But there was this idea of Barbaneth didn't see the common folk the way other people did, right? He married one, Ramza's mother.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, so I guess what I'm asking is there some part of Barbaneth that thought empowering this commoner may be a way we can break this cycle, And isn't that what happens? You made the argument that what Barbaneth was saying here is that the common people should have a future as well as the noble people. And is that not what Delita achieves?
I'm not sure we actually know if that's what Delita achieves. It certainly helped
Sure.
Delita, but do we know how the common people fare after the War of the Lions?
We're told it's a great reign, that it's, I guess,
Sure.
peaceful but and prosperous. So
Absolutely.
I'm to assume that, and especially if he came from the common born, you would think that he would be at least a little better about those things. Wasn't that his speech? How much of that speech was a lie that he
Right.
said to Avelia when he said, I want to exact from them the price of their gluttonous feast?
I would suggest that just because the history tells us that it was a long and prosperous and peaceful reign doesn't necessarily mean
Right.
that it was.
Well,
So I think we don't actually know how much changed. And I'm not sure where the rest of the Ivalis Alliance falls in the timeline, right?
oh, that's, yeah. I mean, it doesn't really comment on that.
So it's, I would say that Barbaneth's goal was probably more along the lines of, because of the way the world works, my sons are going to gain power, and shouldn't at least one of them have an understanding of what it means to be born common. And the way he can have that is if he has a brother in arms who was born common. And that might start a slow process of, well, at least the Beluvian, our house will be good to the common people and actually earn their trust. And upon doing so, other common people will say, hey, we would also like to be able to actually trust the people in power, and that might start, that sort of a slower revolution.
Right.
So I don't think he meant to put.
Oh,
Delita on
no,
the
it
throne.
definitely happened way faster than he
Right.
ever possibly could have imagined. But I mean, in principle, an idea,
Right.
he figured elevating somebody like Delita could bring about a better world for the common people. I can't imagine Barbaneth thought
Right.
in any instance that Delita would become king. Right.
But I also think that in a way, like his goal was to elevate, Delita, as opposed to, say, Odin in Thor's movie, sending Thor to live amongst the common folk. Right? It's sort of going the other way about it. So does that?
Sure.
Is one route better than the other? Do they both achieve the goal we're aiming for? I think it kind of depends. Like the metal of the person, you got to be worthy to wield the hammer.
Right.
Right? So you got to learn how to be worthy. And of the two, I feel like Ramza learned to be worthy and Delita learned to take what you can when you can. But did it ultimately have the goal that he was aiming for? I think that's still left unanswered.
Yeah, well, I think that gets us into our next sort of collection of categories, which is all about legacy here. And, for different characters, individual legacy or family legacy or community legacy matters more, right? And the question for Delita is that we don't know which between individual, community, and family actually mattered the most. Did he do what he did entirely because they killed my sister, and this is just for family revenge, and it's really just about that? Did he do it out of the community legacy of, like we talked about, I'm exacting their gluttonous feast, I am tearing down the rich people and the noblemen and the class system that did this to me? Because he does a lot of that as well.
Right.
He does. And then there's the individual legacy. Did he really just get caught up in some point in the power of it and wanting more and more power and getting rid of anybody who is in his way and literally putting himself on the throne? And I love that it's a story where we don't know for sure. With other characters we do, right? Ramza ends up forsaking family legacy and almost basically decides that community legacy is something he can only fight for in the shadows. He's going to be remembered as a heretic. He is going to live his life with his sister, and they're going to have their personal individual family, and that's what's going to matter to them. But, it's far more complicated for a character like Delita.
Yeah, I mean, his legacy ends up being the historical legacy that then Professor Durai undercuts by being an historian, and that's important. But I don't think he did it for that. Like, I don't think he did it because he wanted to become king and create a lasting peace. Well, maybe he did, because he wanted that lasting peace to have existed for his sister, right?
Right.
I don't think he cared so much about the legacy. What he cared about was burning down the noble houses for revenge, on a personal level. But also what he cared about was maintaining that those kinds of people would stay out of power, would continue to be punished by having a commoner for a king, and the best king that this country has ever known. Like, I feel like revenge is what fueled everything. Like Batman, if Batman becomes the president.
Right.
In a way.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So the church, or a church, or religion, faith in Final Fantasy is kind of a mixed bag, much like Final Fantasy itself. So in the original game, there are churches, which is where you go to revive your characters. So it's more of a game mechanic thing, but you can read into it that there is some faith in something. What exactly it is, given we're in a 1,000-year time loop, maybe it's faith in the sages, or faith in the crystals, or faith in the warriors of light, or whatever. But the next time we're really given any sort of concrete deific powers, so to speak, it's in Final Fantasy VI, the Warring Triumvirate. And then in 7, again, it's real subtle with, Aerith works in a church, but there's not like an organized religion. This is the first one where we've got a real organized religion, and it plays a villainous role. So the manipulation of faith. Is Final Fantasy Tactics suggesting that all faith is just it's just meant to manipulate people, to bilk them of their money? I don't think that's what Tactics is going for, and the reason is Ovelia. For all that the gross men in power are manipulating faith to justify their demon summoning, Ovelia has the truest faith. And I've mentioned before that I'm not a terribly religious person, but I always I worry sometimes that speculative fiction wants to treat the faithful as either manipulated pawns or manipulative puppeteers, and I don't think those are true. I've met plenty of people who are faithful who seem to have a true faith, who really believe in the teachings and in the kinder side of things. And I feel like that Ovelia shows that, and Alma as well, that there is a quieter, kinder faith than is shown by the Church of Galapagos.
Yeah, I think I have a similar interpretation, but I might answer the question slightly differently, because I think my interpretation of the story with those characters specifically is to accomplish what you're talking about there, is to show us that there can absolutely be good people who are people of faith. But I can't imagine that Alma goes on believing after everything that happened to her.
Sure.
And everything that she witnessed, right? Now, I do think, again, that... So you asked, does Final Fantasy Tactics claim that all systems of faith are systems of control? Well, Y-Graph certainly does.
Right, no kidding.
They put those exact words into the mouths of a couple of characters, some of whom belong to the church.
Right.
Right? The fact that even some of the people we see, like Cardinal Delacroix or Lord Falmarv, almost mock other people for believing in Scripture.
Right. When
they're the ones running it. There's a real deep cynicism, I think, that the game does hold toward, and the story does hold, and maybe the writer or whatever, whatever you want to extend to, but it's certainly, I think, making the argument that most systems of faith are systems of control. And while you can find your own way to exist as a good person inside of that system, it can still be very limiting. It could still limit the lives of Alma and Ovelia to the extent that it arguably cost Ovelia hers, and it nearly cost Alma hers. And the only way to save Alma was to destroy the god. It was like literally not especially subtle there. No, I'm with you. I don't think that Because I agree that there's some speculative fiction that in a very kind of hackneyed way just sort of, religion are the bad guys and faith is dumb. And like you said, they're all a bunch of pawns. And I don't think they're doing that here in Tactics. It's a lot more nuanced and interesting than that. But I do think it makes a stronger case than most things that critique religion about why it's problematic, even if elements of it turn out to be true, and you really can summon the blood demon from whatever, like the gems and the crystals and the scriptures are real, right? But it's like they're systems of power,
right?
And they're almost always in the hands of people who use them for corrupt purposes. And there's no better way to manipulate a person, and we're going to talk about the chapter titles here in a minute, the manipulative, than by claiming some sort of knowledge over their immortal soul.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right that Final Fantasy Tactics does claim that the systems of power are so easily abused. But you mentioned you don't think Alma would continue to have faith afterward, and I'm not sure I agree with that. Because while the power of the stones was used to summon demons, one of whom was Saint Ajora. My guess is she's not going to pray to Saint Ajora anymore.
Yeah, at the very least, she's going to switch churches, right?
Right. But we also know that the power of the stones can be used for other things. They're not demonic stones.
Right. Like when Rafa brings back Marek.
Right. So I think between Rafa and Alma, they would develop an understanding of heaven and hell, right? The heaven seer and the nether seer, and have maybe a more complete understanding of the cosmos in that way, which excises systems of power, systems of political power.
Right.
So yeah, and I don't think that theme gets hit near as hard. I think that's a much subtler theme of the game than is, the High Confessor is a backstabbing politician.
Right. But I agree, and we talked about that when Rafa died, and there was a very short conversation where they ask him about the afterlife, and he sort of gets into a little bit of it, and there is this potential recognition that there are spirits and afterlives, and it's not that, like you said, faith or belief or otherworldly things don't exist. It's, as you put it, it's those systems of control. It's once it becomes an organized thing with a set of rules, and if you break one of those rules, then you're the outcast, you're the heretic, you're the whatever. That's when systems of belief become a real problem. Right?
We talked before about how Final Fantasy V is kind of a fairy tale, and 6 is an opera, and 7 is a blockbuster movie, and Final Fantasy Tactics is a re-examination of a history. And so how does an imperfect understanding of history work as a theme in this game? And it starts, like we said, with Arazlam Durai, the great-grandson of Oran Durai, diving into these histories, reading the scriptures of Germanique, reading the Durai papers, his own grandfather or great-grandfather's writings about what actually happened. And is Professor Arazlam Durai here going to get in trouble for doing this research, for reading these papers?
Right.
And that doesn't get resolved either. We don't know what happens to him by uncovering these histories. Maybe it's a more enlightened time. Maybe people are more okay with understanding that His Majesty King Dalita Hyral, the commoner king, the pauper king, was actually kind of a dirtbag. I don't know. But it is interesting that Final Fantasy tends to come down on the side of knowing the truth is good. Knowing the truth is important, even if it's hard, or especially if it's hard. We talked about the library in Final Fantasy V. We talked about that horrifying museum in 7 Remake.
Yeah, so I think it's great because it does allow for a lot of very realistic ambiguity to exist around questions like what were Dalita's true intentions? And, I think it's just a great framework for telling a story to begin with if done well, and so it's a lot of fun because With a lot of stories, sometimes there is this sort of third-person omniscience, like we're supposed to know everything, and then when there are loose ends, you almost feel cheated. Like, why didn't we see everything? Like you were just talking about, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. But if we were really sitting in class listening to Professor Arislam explain the War of the Lions, just like in history class, you're not going to get everything that happened, right? It's not possible. So it helps, again, ground it and give it that level of realism. But it also, and not to totally undercut the conversation we're about to jump into about morality and ethics, but asks this interesting question about, through the lens of history, to what extent does it even matter what Delita's intentions were? This story is very much framed as like, this person got the credit, but this person's the real hero. And I think that it is both important that we know that, like you said, that we know the real truth as opposed to the Shinra, propaganda museum. But if I'm living in the world of Ivalice as shaped by King Delita 100 years later, and I learn this about him, we do this with celebrities a lot. God, we got to deal with those of us who really enjoyed the Harry Potter books growing up. It's like, and then you learn something about a person, and you go, well, does that change what those books and stories meant to me as a kid? Or do I just go, well, no, it's still good, and maybe those stories did more good than the one bad of the person being shitty, but person still shitty. It's important to know both things, right?
Right.
And so that's why I think the framing of the history is so interesting, because when so many other stories would, with that last scene, make you go, oh, Delita, bad guy, to hell with him. Because it's framed this way, you can't really do that. Or maybe you can, but I feel like that's a bit simplistic of a reading, and not recognizing that there are probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people living in a world that's better off because he became king. And while we hate what he did to the individuals we saw him interact with, from the lens of, those people all died 150 years ago. It's interesting, right? It's a little different.
I think you can appreciate the good a person like Delita does, while still saying it was obviously wrong to murder his wife, Queen Ovilia, right? Like if I'm that hypothetical person in Professor Arislam's class, and I say, yeah, obviously this was wrong. He did terrible things. And how does that, how did that inform? How does that compare to, or how do we understand that in the context of also he helped found a society that has lasted 100, 150 years or whatever, and has brought justice to the common folk. But both those things are important to know. Absolutely.
So let's extend the conversation into the next thing that we were going to do. And I'm going to reframe it a little bit. We have this listed as ranking the top 10 worst people of Ivalice. Because again, it's hard to know. How do you really get down to the morality and ethics? Who's the terrible person here? And since Delita is the most interesting person, the one at the heart of the story, and the one we've been talking about the most because of what a phenomenally written character he is, I think what we should do is basically put him at number 1 on the power rankings right now. And I'm going to go through these names, and we're going to decide who of these people are definitely worse than Delita.
Okay.
All right. I'll start with a doozy. I'll start with a really bad one. Let's go with Grand Duke Gareth Barrington.
Fuck this guy. He's awful. Grand Duke Gareth Barrington is a war profiteer, and that's like one of the nicest things he's done.
I was going to say, you're starting light. Yeah. The army of child soldiers, the sexual abuse.
He engineers the fact that they would be orphans, right? Like they're orphans in his land because he keeps going to war all the goddamn time.
Right.
And then, I can raise these children to be what I want. It's like Final Fantasy VIII's Seed, but so much worse. And not only will I raise these children to be my soldiers, I will also raise them to be, my sexual assault victims. But this dude, worse than Delita.
Yes, absolutely. It's going to be hard to top Gareth Barrington. Maybe I shouldn't have started with him, but he may be number 1 on the list. He was awful. Guy gets chucked off a roof, and I've never been happier to see someone just get chucked off a roof. All right, let's talk about the Beowulf brothers next. Zalbag and Dicedarg. Zalbog, I think we're going to say, obviously, the worst thing he does in the story is he's the guy on site who gives the official order to have another person we'll talk about in a minute murder Tetra Hyral.
Right. So Zalbag and Dystarg. Dystarg poisoned his father to gain power, and then tries to manipulate his side of things to take control from Larg, right? So he's a politician, he's a poisoner, he's a murderer. He's the one giving the orders so his hands don't get dirty. But then Zalbag is the one who is taking the order, was just following orders, or was just he's sort of the middle manager of the evil bad guys. And I'm not sure how to say what's worse, but I kind of feel like being a middle manager, I'm just doing what I'm told and then telling
just
others
what orders.
Yeah, the just following orders is always a bullshit position to take. But also he gives orders. So he gets to both not get his hands dirty and not be the one. He gets to he doesn't have to take any responsibility for anything. And then he almost has a turn.
Which is change of heart, but too little too late.
Yeah. And not even enough of a change of heart. He still thinks common people are scum.
Right.
So
despite the fact that Dystarg is almost certainly more responsible for more death and destruction, and he had more power as the eldest brother and was much more of a manipulator as opposed to a subservient, right? You still think that Zalbag's maybe even just a little bit worse?
I feel like at least Dystarg understood his own rottenness. I feel like Zalbag never even got that far. Zalbag never took any sort of responsibility.
So neither as bad as Barrington. Both worse than Delita, or?
Yeah,
I think so.
I feel like Delita takes responsibility for his actions, even if I disagree with his justifications. At least he understands what he's doing is awful. But he also, he's in an awful world, so that's part of the justification.
Right. All right, let's talk about the two sort of regents at the head of the war, the Lions, as it were, the people who you could argue are responsible for the most actual death.
Right.
Certainly in whose orders result in the most amount of death here, Duke Larg and Duke Goltana. First of all, do you see either one as better or worse than the other?
No, I would say they're on equal footing there. I think Larg and Goltana are equally bad. They both are, the one is manipulating the wife of the late king to become regent, putting her toddler son, her infant son on the throne. The other is manipulating the council to say, no, F that nonsense. We're going to raise the king's sister / adopted daughter to the throne. Manipulating children again.
Right.
So I would say they're equally bad. I feel like they're worse than the Bales.
I do too.
Because, like you said, they are responsible for all this death. They could have called a truce a long time ago. If not for their machinations, this bullshit may never have started. Maybe it would have started with somebody else.
Right.
And also, one or both of them is responsible for Manchurian Ovelia, which is horrifying.
Right.
So I would put them as worse people than the Bales, but I feel like Zalbag, if he could, would have been, if he had been in that position, would have done it also. So maybe on the same level as Zalbag.
It's just by station that these guys happen to be worse than the Bales. I agree. I think it's just... And there's also something about them being sort of old, out-of-shape men who give orders from fancy clothes, where at least Dystarg and Zalbag go into battle and stuff. There's something there where these guys are just responsible for so much, and they risk so little, and both go out like such chumps.
Exactly. Yeah, that's well said. I like that a lot.
So worse than the Bales, still not as bad as Barrington, though. At least
no,
I think maybe God, for all they did on just an ethical, moral level, Barrington's still in first. All right, let's talk about the creepy religious weirdos, the Marquis Elmdor, Lord Falmarv, and High Confessor Marcel. I'll throw in. And Cardinal Delacroix.
Sure.
Fulmarv ends up being almost the final boss, basically. He's right there at the end. His machinations were probably the worst of the religious people here, though again, High Confessor
Yeah.
Marcel by station may have been more responsible for not doing anything about it and for allowing the church to be an instrument of corruption for so long.
Right. I would say that Elmdor and Fulmar, the Templar in general, are in a different position because they're also possessed by Lucavi.
Right.
But I think Fulmarv at least was already headed down that path, whereas Elmdor gets drawn in because he's gifted a stone and then killed in battle and then rises from the dead. Right. So I would almost put that as less awful because they're sort of demonic spirits. I don't know. Is that a weird thing to say?
No, I mean, I think if we're giving them a little bit of a, I don't know, pass is the right word, but I understand what you're saying of like they may not be in full control of their faculties right now. Like, I think there could be some of that. If we put that aside a little bit and just judge it as one person based on their actions, I think Fulmarv is relatively high on the list.
Yeah.
You know, he set up his own son to get murdered, if not outright murdered his own son. Right? He's certainly one of the most cold-blooded people throughout the story, someone who's willing to sacrifice. You know, we say Delita's willing to sacrifice just about anybody in his way, but he doesn't seem eager to.
Right.
He seems willing to if he has to.
I might put Fulmarv on the same level as Zalbag, or excuse me, Dystarg, because he's given those orders and is so calculated and cold-blooded. But he knows exactly what he's doing. It's the
So
Dystarg,
you're going to give Elmdor the Zalbag thing, where you're being a middleman and you're just trying to get what you can out of it. You're being slimy little,
Yeah. So the ones who are the middlemen, strike me as worse than the ones who at least understand and admit to what they're doing.
Yeah. How about Cardinal Delacroix?
The people in charge of the church. Delacroix and Confessor Marcel. There's even that bit where Marcel's like, "Oh, I'd be happy to negotiate a truce." Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right.
So trying to put himself above the fray in the War of the Lions, remain neutral here in Galapagos, when really they're manipulating everything.
Right.
At the expense, again, of the people who can't eat, who don't have enough food.
Right.
So that puts them, again, in the manipulators category of this ranking.
All right, here's a couple of interesting ones from earlier in the story. There's Gustav, if you recall him, who was like, after everything we've just talked about, I don't know, he was a mercenary who was willing to sell off a noble person for some money. I don't know. It doesn't sound so bad to me.
Yeah, he's certainly further down that list for me. Because it's like he kidnaps Titra, right? They're the ones who conduct the raid on the Beowulf household, thinking they're getting a Beowulf kid, and they get Titra instead. It's bad, but on the scale that we're talking about, it's not as bad. I would say he's less bad than Delita.
Yeah, I think he's the least bad one we've talked about so far. Even though he did kidnap Titra, again, it's not he didn't have any intention of murdering her.
Right. Well, and then when she's murdered, he's like, "Holy shit!"
Yeah, what the hell? What's wrong with you guys? And then another interesting one who I think is going to be near the back of the list, but Wygraf might be right in the middle of the spectrum of like who's a bad guy, who's a good guy or whatever. Because in the beginning, we're very much with him. Like,
oh yeah,
he and his family and his friends and his people were screwed, and long live the Corpse Brigade, and I can't believe what they did to his sister Maluda. But at some point, he just takes that turn and becomes a believer. And the only way that I can, and much like with Delita, the only way I can avenge my sister is to take power. The only difference is he takes one of those stones and becomes demonic and can't really go back after that point. Back to your point with the other guys of how much is it their fault. So Wygraf, it's like, to what extent do we hold him responsible? Because I feel like we understand his motivations 100% of the way through the story, but we understand his actions like 70 to 80, maybe 90% of the way. But there's a point where you just go, dude.
Right. So,
as Ramza keeps saying, this is not what your sister would have wanted.
Right. And we've talked about some of the Final Fantasy villains as being forces of nature, right? Exeth is kind of a force of nature, the cloud of darkness, maybe even Necron, right? So maybe the Lucavi are almost a force of nature, right? And so that sort of takes people like the Templars, who are now possessed by this force of nature, out of the running for being awful, because they're just doing what they do. A tornado's not evil, maybe. So does Wygraf fall along those same... Is Wygraf worse than Delita, I guess? Or does he fall in that same...
I feel like they're right in that same area. I feel like Wygraf's just a little bit worse, because once he turns into a monster, he becomes a kind of indiscriminate killer. And I don't know that Delita ever goes, even though...
Sure.
Close.
He's very discriminate in his killing.
Exactly. And finally, we've got Argoth Thadalphus.
Yeah.
The central classist of the team. The man who loosed the arrow that murdered Tetra Hyrule and comes back later inhabited as a spirit, but spends every waking and undead moment he has in Ivalice just decrying the little people. How much damage does he actually cause? How many people does he kill? Much lower body count than some of the other people we've talked about, but his worldview and what he maybe would be capable of if he did have the power of any of these other people.
Right. He's still not as bad as Barrington. But I think he would be had he had the power.
Right.
I think that's exactly who he wants to be, is Barrington.
Yeah.
Just using.
And so what's
people,
worse, the devil or the guy who runs into the 7-Eleven to get the devil a pack of cigarettes?
Right. So I would say he's worse than Zalbag, but not as bad as Barrington, but only for lack of means. At the same time, he's kind of like Zalbag in that he does what he's told.
Yeah.
Yeah, but God, maybe Zalbag's worse.
No.
Because Zalbag, again, no self-awareness of his own shittiness. Right? No taking responsibility for anything. Or at least Argath, again, like Dicedard, knows exactly who he is.
Yeah, and but he revels in it. He revels in the cruelty of being better than others, and it's
so
gross.
Is it worse to revel in the cruelty, or is it worse to have no concept of even the cruelty you're committing?
Right.
And I think it's worse to just be oblivious.
Yeah.
Because it's not like Zalbag had no opportunities to learn. And he almost got there. But then he was killed. So would he have gotten there? I don't know. Would that have changed my opinion of him? Probably not.
Brutal. I still got to go with Argoth on this one, but I understand.
Fair enough.
So that gets us into one of the last couple of things that we want to do here. This part I don't think is going to take too long, but I did want to have one final conversation on the titles of the chapters now that we've experienced the entire story. Just as a narrative device, I think these concepts are really interesting. The first 3 chapters, and it's a 4-chapter story, are all descriptors of groups of people. So chapter 1 was the meager. Chapter 2 was the manipulative and the subservient. And chapter 3 was the valiant. Before we get to chapter 4, I thought it would be interesting if we went through some of these characters and see if we can figure out who fits into which category. So beginning with chapter 1, Ira, we have the meager. Who in Final Fantasy Tactics are the meager?
Sure. The Corpse Brigade, I think, is the meager. The common folk in general, but also Tetra.
Yeah.
Even though she is, like we talked about, raised by Papa Beowulf to be a member of the Beowulf house, she remains mocked at school, right? Alma points that out. So I think, in a way, the meager might also be the meek, right? It doesn't have to be meager has sort of a negative connotation.
Yeah, blessed are the meager, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be negative.
Right.
Right. It could be, the people who, through no fault of their own, are tread underfoot when the gears of war, grind their way through the cropless fields.
Right.
So anybody who is killed or hurt by the engine of destruction that is the War of the Lions, those are the Meagers. So Tetra, I think, is the number one example, but also Ovelia.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if
I was
it's
going to ask.
true.
I think she fits as well. I think she counts as a Meager. Yeah, especially if she's not really of royal birth.
But also, I would say King Baby.
Sure.
Oh God, what's his name? The infant who they use as a
Ornis.
symbol to start the whole war.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily fit just who's born on which side of the walls.
Right.
It's just about who does not have any power and is therefore punished.
I'll add one more group of people. The not entirely faceless, not entirely nameless heroes of the story of Final Fantasy Tactics, and that is the retinue that you often brought up and wanted to make sure that we didn't leave out. And, sometimes there's Alicia and Lad, but whoever you name, you can name a bunch of them, but all of the different recruits that you have throughout. We've talked in the Rebels versus Empire episode about how it's unfortunate that a lot of times in these stories where we have to take down the Empire, there do have to be royals involved and nobles involved, because those are typically the people who have any ability to do anything about it whatsoever. And we make Ramza a bastard, so it's better, it's closer, though it would be hard to say he fits into the category of meager. But all of his companions, not like the Thunder God, not him,
Right.
but most of his companions, Rafa and Marek, and them for sure, but the ones that don't get the names are heroes in this story as well. Everyone who fought alongside Ramza and his companions. All right. Who are the manipulative? We just named a bunch of them.
Right.
But not
That
all
whole
of the
list.
villains are, not all of them, because as we said, some of them are subservient, right? You seem to have a particular ire for the subservient, like Argoth and Zalbog.
Yeah.
Who are some of the other subservients? Because the manipulative, I think we just named most of them, but who are some other subservients?
Right. I feel like Valmafra ends up as one of the subservient also.
Yeah.
Right. But also she won't go through with certain things, and so she gets to be kind of heroic in some ways. But this whole world, this whole country is built around creating subservience, right? Doing what you're told. So there are, we come across some deserters, right? And they might be seen as meager, but then it's, but if we turn them in, then we'll get a cash reward. And now they become the subservient, right? They are manipulated.
Right.
So that, I think, is interesting also. So anybody who is just following orders or is just looking out for themselves in the way that this world tends to
Demand?
I was going to say reward, but yeah.
Oh, sure. Both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's interesting. And I can understand falling victim to that because you want to protect yourself. You want to protect your family. But,
Right.
But being blind to the harm that causes is pretty awful. Is something we should strive to avoid. Even if we do fall into the trap from time to time, recognizing it and trying to do better can pull us out of being the subservient, which may be even worse than being the manipulative.
So how about this comparison and contrast for you? Two potential subservient characters. Agrius Oaks, subservient to Ovelia and to her honor. And Gafgarian, subservient to whoever has the most coin.
Yeah. I think the distinction between them is the harm they cause. Right? The harm Agrius causes that is in service to a character I was just praising for having true faith.
Right.
In Ovelia. Right? I don't think she would have agreed to be the Holy Knight for Delacroix or Marcel or the Template.
Sure. Right.
And so she is subservient in that way, especially early on, though I think she moves to another category later on. Gafgarian, on the other hand, is unconcerned with the harm he causes. So he absolutely recognizes. I think he's again on the Dystarg end of things with, he's subservient to money because that's how you survive. And we talked about how we can appreciate his position even if we disagree with it. Like, he gets this world. He gets this world better than just about anybody else.
Right.
It doesn't matter who's sitting on the throne. What matters is if you can eat tonight and have a dry bed, and if I got to kill some folks to do it, So
Yeah.
I'm not sure that makes him worse necessarily.
Right. So as you alluded to a moment ago, now we move to our final category of people. And we don't have to list too many here because I do think it's by the end of the story, our heroes are the valiant, right? We've got Ramza and Agrias and T.G. Sid. And I agree, a lot of the folks that we put in the meager category would also fit in the valiant category, Alma and Ovelia and so on. And it's interesting that that particular word is used, and that gets back to the ongoing, arguably most interesting conversation about Final Fantasy Tactics and Delita. There's a lot of good words we could use, and I've done my best to try to argue throughout this whole thing that he's not just this evil guy we can dismiss and that he brought about a lot of good. But was he valiant? Not a word I would maybe ascribe to King
Me
Delita.
neither. Yeah.
So there's something to be said for the way you do a thing.
Right. I would also want to point out the Derais, both
Yes.
Sid's adopted son and the Professor Arazlam. You know, writing down the truth, recording what actually happened, and insisting that the history exist as it happened, and then insisting that it be known is, I think, valiant.
And Chapter 4 chucks the trend and is not about a group of people, but is rather titled In the Name of Love. And so I ask very simply, Ira, what in Final Fantasy Tactics is done in the name of love?
I kept saying that this is a small story against a big backdrop. The War of the Lions is the backdrop, but it's not really what the story is about. What the story is about is Ramza trying to protect his sister. If we want to be reductive, right? That's what it comes down to. How do I protect my sister who I love? So what is done in the name of love? Well, Mustadio gives Agrias that present for her birthday. That's really cute.
It is cute.
I don't know if that was done in the name of love, but but he protects his father also.
Yeah.
Agrias continues to protect Ovelia.
Rafa revives her brother.
Yes. Miliadul avenges. I would say her avenging her brother Isolde is done in love, as opposed to
In the name of love.
as opposed to how Delita tries to avenge his sister, right?
Which I would argue is still in the name of love. I would argue that everything Delita does is done in the name of love. Just his own twisted, brutal interpretation of it, right? It's like you said, it is all revenge for what happened to her. But if our two opposing major forces here are Ramza and Delita, which they are, like you said, everything Ramza does after a fashion, after a certain point, is for his sister, for the love of his sister. And so is Delita's. It's just that one of them is alive and the other isn't.
Maybe Wygraf and Maluda?
Absolutely.
Sid and Oron. Sid tries to protect Oron several times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Delita and Valmafra?
Maybe, but Valmafra might run off with Oron, right?
Sure.
We're not entirely clear about that.
Right.
Certainly, they're together at the end. So yeah, it's all those small relationships that win out and move some of the biggest pieces in the war.
Right. The people who do things in the name of power or in the name of progressing and getting more for their house or whatever, which was Dystarg and Zalbog, dead.
Yep.
The Chancellor, dead. All the Templars, dead. So basically, the only people who are still alive... Now, there are people who did things in the name of love who also ended up dead. It was a brutal story.
Right. And one more I want to bring up. Beowulf, Ramza, and Alma's mother. And maybe he loved his previous wife also, right? But the way... I think Papa Beowulf, Barbaneth, loved his children, but worried about the older boys not doing things right.
Right. So the wisdom that he gave to the younger children in the name of love, it was maybe Barbaneth's love passed on to those youngest children that preserved some good in such a dark world. All right, Ira, I have another candidate for in the name of love, but it also requires some headcanon. So I'm going to ask the question and get your answer, and then I'm going to give you my headcanon read of the story that we've been discussing, really, particularly from Delita's perspective. But does Delita do things in the name of love for Ovilia? Does he love her?
Maybe.
Yeah.
He might.
Yeah.
But if he does, isn't he one of those guys who posts to Reddit who's like, am I the asshole for stealing my wife's throne, even though I'm going to... Look, there's going to be record peace, all right? There's going to be record peace like you've never seen before in this country.
Right.
Yeah. Red flags, but maybe.
All right, so here's my headcanon, and then I'll ask the question again. First, whether or not you accept this interpretation of the story, and then whether or not this qualifies as love. Because I think, and we talked about how it's an inaccurate historical account, or an imperfect a more accurate than used to be, but still an imperfect historical account. And I think the actual answer to the question is we don't really know. And that's one of the cool things about Final Fantasy Tactics, right? But here's my theory. After Tetra is killed, there's a period of time there over a year or so where we don't really know what Delita was doing specifically. We just know that he was formulating this plan, right, to take down the nobles, to exact his revenge on the people who had done him harm. I tend to believe that what happened was he became a cold and heartless bastard during this time, and he swore to himself, I will do whatever it takes. If I die along the way, so be it. But I'm going to kill whoever I need to, and hopefully make sure that Gultana is dead, Larg is dead, the Chancellor is dead. They're all of them dead. I don't think he intended to necessarily even put himself on the throne. I think he just wanted to kill them all. And then, after going to kidnap Ovilia, I believe he saw another Tetra in her, another Meager, another innocent bystander who was getting wrapped up in this. And he legitimately started to question his own plan because of what it was doing to her as he was sort of kidnapping her, right, in the midst of the kidnapping. And I believe that he does fall in love with Ovilia. But he's already done all of these terrible things. He's executed 2/3 of his plan. He's there now. And all he has to do is cross a few more names off the ledger, put the plan in motion, and all of these people are either going to kill each other or he's got to do a couple of them himself. But it works. And he was more than happy to accept the W and be in love and live happily ever after with her. But she... now that she knows what he became during that time, who he was, what he had to do to get there, she could never accept that. And that is the tragedy of Delita and Ovilia, that they love each other for who they are, but it was too late because Delita had already become this horrible person. I don't know. What do you think?
Drogo approves.
Doggy approval.
I can absolutely buy the idea that he fell for her. Seeing her in this shitty position, him being in a shitty position, seeing that kindred spirit, absolutely. Love is interesting though, right? Did he love her? Did he just see her as a pawn? Was it neither? Something in between? I could see her, or I could see Ovilia falling for him, I think. Before she realizes just how far he's gone. Him falling for her, though, I think you're right that he was walling himself off after the death of Tetra. I could absolutely see him not even expecting to survive this himself. Not only did he not expect to sit on the throne, he didn't expect to make it out of the War of the Lions alive.
Right.
So did he love her, though? Gosh, that's tough.
Yeah.
And let me put it this way: even if he did fall for her, even if he was gonna, treat her the way you treat people you love, what he did was not in the name of love. What he did was in the name of burn it all down. So it wasn't for love of Ovelia that he put her on the throne. Maybe that he didn't kill her the first opportunity he had.
Right.
Right. Maybe that he didn't.
That's what I believe. Mm-hmm. He truly came to care for her. Yeah.
Right. And he had that same affection for Valmafra, right? He didn't off her when he probably should have.
Right. Right.
So it's not that there's no, it's not that he doesn't care for anybody, even though he's trying to wall himself off. But I don't think he did it in the name of love.
Excellent point, and I think I agree.
And I did think of another one. The relationship between Ramza and Delita is very brotherly.
Mm.
And there are times when Delita could have rid himself of this troublesome heretic, and he was manipulating Ramza some. But he let him go a couple times when he didn't have to. He let Valmafra go when he didn't have to.
Right.
So the brotherhood, the love between Delita and Ramza, I would say that one was important also.
And maybe the thing that stopped Delita from becoming a true tyrant is holding on to that love for his brother, that recognition of that, and for their father.
Yeah.
Who taught them how to make a whistle of a blade of grass.
Yeah.
All right, let's do this last thing real quick where we go through the 5 different categories we do with each game and try to talk about how successful Final Fantasy Tactics is and what its ultimate legacy is as a Final Fantasy game. And we begin with number 5, the one that I find to be the 5th most important, and that is flaws. What are the flaws of Final Fantasy Tactics? We kind of went through this throughout the game, right? There aren't many. There are a couple of really weird design choices where you can get stuck in boss fights, and that should just be fixed.
The Archer class is kind of boring.
Okay.
Because the way the abilities it has aren't that great, because it's just the charge ability several times. The Dragoon class, much as I love it, is kind of boring in this game.
Yeah.
The side quests, I want to go on the side quests. I want bigger fights. I want to be able to use all my characters.
Yeah.
After that,
it's not available on enough systems. That's the biggest flaw with Final Fantasy Tactics, honestly, is that you cannot easily play it right now. You have to play it like on your cell phone or whatever. And it just needs to be more readily available. All right. Number 4 is its cultural impact. And this is one that, because of what I was just talking about, is unfortunately pretty limited.
Yeah.
This is where we would talk about, how much do you see it at Comic-Cons? How much does it live on in the zeitgeist? And as we're learning through these Final Fantasy Fight Club polls,
right,
these characters are pretty underrated, and just not enough people have been able to play the game, and that's limited, unfortunately, its impact on the culture at large. It's probably one of the lowest in the franchise, whereas we just talked about Final Fantasy VII, which is arguably has the biggest cultural impact of any of these games. Tactics has had almost none. Hopefully, again, it gets revived so it can have some. Category number 3, how well crafted is it? 10 out of 10s in almost every category.
Yeah, even though we were sort of down on some of the music in a way, I've thought about that a little bit, and we kind of mentioned it at the time, but like the battle music is not ba 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 ba, like it's not driving, right? It's not battle music, but it's kind of battle music for a tactics game. So I think that the art does a good job here and there of emphasizing the tactics nature of the game, and that the choices you make in game are reinforced by this methodical story. Right? You make slow, methodical choices in the gameplay.
Right.
The story is fairly slow and methodical, as is much of the music. And I think the art style does a good job keeping things grounded, even though we do eventually get to demon possessions.
Right. So, like you said, the music may be one of the few categories I'd maybe give it an 8 or a 9, and that's only if we're comparing it to other Final Fantasy games, truly. The music is quite excellent. As you mentioned, the art, while it may not be visually the most stunning stuff you've ever seen. I think it's really, really good for what it does, and it even has this kind of long-lasting legacy. I'm playing Triangle Strategy right now, which is a game that's very purposefully trying to pull on the nostalgia of that art style, right? Gameplay, 10 out of 10, despite what you mentioned about the classes. It's still the gold standard for tactical RPGs. It and Tactics Ogre together. Don't come for me in the comments. And do it. And then the other things, like when we talk about the story, we'll get into a little bit more, but I want to say the script, there's a reason we read so much from it. There are Hollywood films and television shows that have won awards for writing that aren't as well written as Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions. It's extraordinary in its script. Most of its characters are phenomenal. So yeah, it's just a really, really well put together story / game / piece of art. And it's why it continues to exist in my S tier of Final Fantasy games, because it just knocks it out of the park in all of those sort of traditional, quote, measurable categories, right? Number 2, its industry impact. This is an interesting conversation to have right this moment.
Yeah, you were just talking about Triangle Strategy, right?
Yeah. So there hadn't been a ton of industry impact. It wasn't like there was a bunch of strategy games that started coming out after this, though there were more. There are some really interesting ones, and like the Disgaea series.
Yep.
Like there's some great ones out there, but it certainly didn't popularize a genre the way that, say, Final Fantasy VII did. That said, as I was just mentioning, it is kind of the gold standard tactical RPG, and even with the release of Triangle Strategy, which is very, very good, but not quite this good, and Tactics Ogre, which maybe now some people are saying that's close, but right, that's always been the argument. So industry-wide, outside of its genre, not a ton of impact. Inside of its genre, it's the king. And that's pretty cool. Which is, by the way, twice that Final Fantasy has done that, because they've also now done it with MMORPGs.
It's got to be a heck of a thing to set the bar and then try to do... But that's part of what Final Fantasy does, though, right? Is it doesn't do the same thing again, so it doesn't have to worry about meeting its own bar.
Right.
It's kind of like, that Punch-Out game came out however many years ago now, and it like perfectly did what Punch-Out is supposed to do, and then they haven't made another one since.
Right. Why yeah.
Why bother?
No. Yeah.
But if Punch-Out did something different every single time, then it could, like Final Fantasy does.
Right.
So that is one of the benefits of having this particular title, I guess.
And in our number 1 category of cultural commentary, that's what we've been talking about this whole time. It's an endless well. It feels like this is where it scores a 20 out of 10 S+ tier game in terms of its cultural commentary. Even people who've never played the game have seen the memes of if a crime just exists for what it was. If the penalty for a crime is a fine, then it only exists for those of the lower class. Right. People know Wygraff's speech. People who've never played Final Fantasy Tactics know that it's a down with the man. Systems are corrupt. The cops in the church are the bad guys. It's just
absolutely.
And it pulls no punches. It's incredible. Final Fantasy Tactics is unique.
An incredible game from top to bottom, and a story as intricate and mature as any in its world-renowned franchise. Tactics still manages to be underrated and under-discussed.
But for those who have played it, there may not be another experience in gaming that can quite match it.
The story of Ramza Beowulf's transformation from nobleman to heretic to rebel leader to forgotten hero stretches through history and memory, reminding us that even in such a vast saga as the War of the Lions, sometimes the smallest stories, like a brother's love for his sister, are the most important.
Final Fantasy Tactics isn't afraid to ask controversial questions like, is faith just a system of control? Who answers for the sins of the father? Is long-lasting peace justification for power won through violence and deception?
It is purposefully different from other Final Fantasies. It's a different style of game from a different writer, director, artist, and composer. It is as different from the Final Fantasy of its time as Final Fantasy II was from Final Fantasy I.
And so, though it does not have a number, that difference, that deviation from expectation, marks it just as strongly as the title of Final Fantasy. That's it for this episode, and for our series on Final Fantasy Tactics, though I promise we will return to it with some in-depth conversation in the future, and probably not too long from now. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you to everyone who's reached out to us. Feel free to let us know what we missed, got wrong, or should have mentioned by hitting us up on Twitter at FFWeeklyPod. You can leave a comment right here on the Patreon page, or you can always hit me up in the Discord. You know I'm down to chat in there anytime and every time. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, by the way, over at Everything is Final Fantasy, and stick with us as we get ready to ramp up our entire series on Final Fantasy VIII.